There was a woman who bought land nobody wanted, with money nobody thought she had, and the one who would change everything was a goat, 60 of them actually, and a stone well that had been waiting underground for longer than either of them had been alive. There was a woman who bought land nobody wanted. She arrived at the edge of it on a Tuesday morning in early spring, when the frost had not yet decided whether it was leaving, carrying a deed that still smelled of the county clerk's office and the faint embarrassment of a room full of men who had not expected her to follow through. Her name was Mirith. She was 31 years old. She was an Orc woman in a county where Orc families had been sharecropping other people's land for 4 generations without ever holding a deed of their own, and the 60 acres she had purchased at the back tax auction for $940 represented everything she had saved in 11 years of shearing wool, pulling fence posts, birthing lambs in the cold hours before dawn, and mending equipment for men who paid her in cash and never learned her last name. $940 a Tuesday morning, and 60 acres of brushy, briar-choked, scrub-oak-tangled land that the previous owner's estate had let go unpaid for. By the way, wherever in the world you're listening from right now, drop it in the comments. I genuinely love seeing how far these stories travel. Okay, where were we? She was standing at the edge of her 60 acres, and the land looked back at her the way hard things always do, without apology, without welcome, without any promise that it would ever yield. The brush was chest-high in places. The eastern fence line had collapsed into itself and lay rusting in long brown coils. Somewhere in the middle of it all, according to the old survey map she had unfolded 7 times on the auction house table, there was supposed to be a stone well. She could not see it. She could not see much of anything, except hawthorn and sumac and the skeletal upper branches of trees that had not been touched in a decade. She had 60 goats. She had a second-hand tent, a cookpot, a bedroll, and a hand-drawn list of 11 things she needed to do first. She started with item 1. The heart does not rebuild on grand days. What she was learning, standing there in the frost-bitten early light, was that every piece of land that had ever fed anybody had once looked exactly like this. The closest property with a standing structure belonged to a man named Corvin Asheld, and she had not yet met him. She knew his name from the county deed map, and she knew his fence from the way it was different from every other fence on the road. Tight, well-maintained, the posts square and plumb even on the turns. The kind of fence that told you something about who had built it and how much they intended it to last. She had noted this without deciding what it meant about him, because in her experience, good fences and good men were coincident. Maybe half the time she met him on her 4th day. She had spent the first 3 clearing ground-level brush with the goats, pulling wire by hand in the mornings, and carrying water from the county road culvert in 2 5-gallon buckets, until her shoulders ached in a way that felt permanent. On the 4th day, she was repairing the eastern fence line when she heard boots on gravel and looked up. He was perhaps 45, tall, with the kind of build that comes from years of outdoor work rather than any intention toward it. Broad through the shoulders, thickened at the hands, the sort of man whose body has become a record of what he has done with it. He was carrying a fence post driver in one hand and a silence that felt like it had been there a long time. He stopped at the property line. She straightened and waited. He said, "Your eastern posts are rotted through at the base. You'll pull that wire taut, and they'll just snap." He said it the way someone states a weather fact. No introduction, No greeting, no softening. She looked at the post nearest her. He was right. "I can see that," she said. "I've got spare posts in the barn, 22 of them. Red cedar, 3 seasons dry. They do your eastern line and half your northern." "At what price?" she said. "I don't need anything," he said. "Then I don't need the posts," she said. A pause long enough to be interesting. "Called it a land neighbor arrangement," he said. "Your fence holds, the whole road holds." She considered this. It was a practical argument, and it was technically true. She could accept it without being in anyone's debt. "I'll take them," she said, "and I'll do my own driving." He almost smiled. It didn't quite arrive. He set the post driver down on his side of the line and walked back the way he had come. What she did not yet know was that his wife had been dead for 3 years, that the house behind those plumb-set posts had 7 rooms and only one of them in regular use, and that grief, when left untended, grows into a kind of architecture. Rooms you don't enter, doors you keep closed, windows you've stopped looking out of. The posts were stacked in the precise order she would need them, by length, north to south, when she came to collect them the next morning. She did not mention this. She loaded them into her barrow and drove everyone herself. Over the following 3 weeks, the goats moved across the 60 acres in the slow, methodical way that goats do. Browsers by nature, working the briars down to stubs, nosing through the scrub oak, returning to the hawthorn with the cheerful determination of creatures who do not recognize impossibility as a category. Marath moved with them. She slept in the tent and woke before light, and spent her mornings on fence work and her afternoons following the herd, stacking wood that would dry into fuel, marking on her survey map what had been cleared and what remained. Where the soil opened up darker and deeper, she drew small circles and the letter P for possibility. On the 23rd day, the lead goat, an elderly nanny she called Soot because she was the color of a cold fireplace, stopped in the middle of the densest thicket on the property and refused to move. Goats are not known for stillness. Marath went to see what had arrested her. Beneath 3 years of fallen leaves and a snarl of root-bound briar, there was stone, cut stone, laid in a circle, the old, unmistakable geometry of a hand-dug well. The cap had fallen in partially, but the structure was intact. Coursed fieldstone fitted so tightly the wall had held its shape for 50 years at minimum, probably more. Marath crouched and laid one hand on the stone and felt for the first time since she had signed the deed something she could only call recognition, as though the land had been waiting to show her this one thing before it asked whether she intended to stay. She dropped a pebble into the dark and counted 7 seconds. The sound that came back was the flat, ringing note of water. She sat beside the well for a long time. Soot stood next to her and chewed on nothing in particular. That evening, Corvin Ascheld appeared at her eastern fence line without announcement. She was beginning to understand that announcement was not a mode he operated in. He had a casserole dish covered with a cloth. She looked at it. "My sister sent too much," he said. "Does your sister know that?" Marath asked. Another, almost smile. "She will," he said, and set it on the fence post and walked back to his truck. She ate it. It was good, thick with root vegetables and smoked meat, the kind of food that had been made in large quantities for a family, and continued to be made in large quantities by habit. She washed the dish and left it on the fence post the next morning, clean, with a folded paper underneath that said, I found the well. She did not know why she told him that. She decided afterward that it was because he was the first person who had not treated her land as a joke, and some information wants to travel toward the person most likely to understand it. He knocked on her tent pole that evening, an odd gesture, courteous in its way, making a door out of canvas, and said, "Can I see it?" "It was not quite a question tomorrow morning," she said. "Before the herd moves." He came at first light. She showed him the well. He crouched the same way she had, one hand on the stone, and read it the way a person reads something written in a language they know but haven't spoken in a while. "Hand-laid," he said. 80, 90 years old, whoever dug this. "Intended to stay, so do I," she said. He looked at her then, fully, the way he had not quite done before, and she let herself be looked at, which was its own kind of statement. He said the well would need its cap restored before the rains came, and he had stone from an old outbuilding he'd pulled down 2 summers ago that would match close enough, if she wanted it. "At what price?" she said. "Same arrangement," he said. "All right," she said. They worked on the well cap together over 4 mornings. He knew how to read the old coursing and fit new stone to it without disturbing the original work. She mixed the pointing mortar and passed him stones and watched how his hands knew things that his face kept quiet. Once she handed him a stone that was wrong for the gap, and he said without looking up, "Not that one," and reached past her hand for a different piece, and the transaction was so ordinary and so free of any weight that she felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was tight. When the cap was done, they tested the pulley system he had rigged from salvaged iron hardware and a length of rope he had simply brought without mentioning it. The first bucket came up clear and cold and smelled of deep mineral earth. She drank some, he drank some, Soot drank some. Without waiting to be invited, that was the 41st day. Over the weeks that followed, a shape began to form out of what had been formlessness. The goats had cleared 39 of the 60 acres by the time the serious spring rains arrived, and under the rain, the cleared land turned the color she had hoped for. The green of things that had been waiting under suppression for years and were now without ceremony, simply growing. Grasses first, then clover, then the thin-bladed species that come when soil begins to heal. She walked it every morning and made notes. The 11 items on her original list were finished. She had written a new one. The new list had a house on it. She did not yet have the money for a house. What she had was the cleared land, 39 acres of new pasture, and 60 healthy goats, whose milk she was selling at the farmer's market 17 miles away every Saturday, building a reputation among local cheesemakers for consistency and quality. She had also, without particularly intending it, a neighbor who checked the fence line after hard storms, who had left a second kerosene lamp on her fence post one evening without a note, and who had begun to linger after the practical work in a way that was unmistakably something other than practicality. His grief was visible in the ways grief becomes visible when someone stops performing its absence. He had been, she gathered from small disclosed things, a man of considerable warmth before his wife died. Someone who cooked for the whole road and fixed machinery for neighbors and told quiet stories on back porches. 3 years of loss had pulled all of that inward. His house was clean in the way things are clean when maintained out of discipline rather than warmth. She knew this from the one time she stepped inside to return a borrowed tool. 7 rooms, and the one in daily use was the kitchen, where a small painted clay pot sat on the shelf, the lid set slightly crooked, as though someone had just lifted it to check on something, and been interrupted, and never come back to straighten it. She noticed the pot, and said nothing. He noticed her noticing, and said nothing. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. What she did say, standing in his kitchen doorway with the returned tool in her hands, was, "You don't have to leave the lamp on the fence post. I know where you are if something goes wrong." He was quiet for a moment. "The lamp isn't for emergencies," he said. She held that sentence a long time on the walk home. 2 weeks later she moved out of the tent. Not into his house. That was not what happened. What happened was that 3 of her Saturday cheesemaker customers asked what it would take to set up a formal supply contract. She told them. They agreed. With that contract, she was able to borrow against the land and the contract together for enough to put up a simple 2-room structure on the northwest corner of her property, frame construction, wood stove, a real roof. She built most of it herself over 6 weeks. Corvin helped with the roof framing because roof framing requires 2 pairs of hands, and there is no practical argument against this. The 2 rooms were small. They were hers. She slept the first night in them differently than she had slept in years. Not more deeply, but with a quality of settledness, as though the address had told her body something true. She had been sending money home since she left. $47 when she could. $80 when she could. Home was a town 300 miles south, where her mother still sharecropped the same land her grandmother had, where her younger brother, Theron, was 17 and working the same fields and had, she knew, the same capacity for other things that she had once concealed, because ambition in a young orc in that county was not considered an asset so much as a provocation. She wrote letters. She described the goats, the well, the pasture coming in. She did not name Corvin. She described only a neighbor who understood that practical exchange and kindness were not opposites. It was in the middle of this growth, in this season of milk contracts and frame construction and early morning walks across greening pasture, that the threat arrived. His name was Pender Voss. He was an attorney representing the estate of the man whose family had originally owned the 60 acres. And he arrived on a Wednesday in a vehicle that cost more than everything she owned, wearing clothes pressed in a hotel room that morning. Carrying a leather document case and the particular composure of a man who has won by the same method many times and expects to win again. He stood at her eastern fence line and waited for her to come to him. She recognized the technique and came at her own pace, which was the pace of someone who has a fence post to finish before the rain. Pender Voss explained in the tone of a man explaining gravity that the original back tax auction had been procedurally flawed. The notice period had been short by 2 business days, per an amended county statute revised 8 months before the auction. A formal petition to void the sale had been filed with the county court 4 days ago. The estate was prepared to return her $940 in full. He said this with the implication that this was generosity, and she should naturally want to avoid the cost of contesting this in court. Marath looked at him the way she had looked at the 60 acres, on that first Tuesday morning, without flinching, taking the full measure of what was in front of her. "I want to see the petition," she said. He said he was not obligated to provide it at this stage. "Then I have nothing to say to you today," she said. He began to speak again, louder, in the way that some men deploy volume as though it were logic, and she turned back to her fence post and drove it. He left. That evening, she walked to Corvin's fence line and stood there until he came out, which took 3 minutes because he had seen Voss's vehicle and had been waiting. She told him what had happened in the order it happened. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "The notice period statute. Do you have a copy of the original auction notice?" She had 4 copies. She kept records the way her mother had taught her. Every paper, every date, every signature. "There's a man in town named Osbert Quill," Corvin said. "He was the county recorder for 22 years. He knows every statute and its revision date and the date that revision was published in the County Gazette. He has no patience for procedural nonsense dressed as law." She had not heard of Osbert Quill. She said so. "He's not well known to people who haven't needed him," Corvin said, "but he is not difficult to find. I'll take you Thursday morning, if you want, unless you'd rather go alone." Alone was her default, and she was good at it. But she also understood that in a county where her face and her tusks, and the particular gray-green of her complexion, had been read as reasons to underestimate her at every auction, every market stall, every fence line, there was sometimes a specific and pragmatic value in arriving beside someone the room already knew. "Thursday," she said, 7 o'clock. Osbert Quill was 73 years old, short and precise, with the hands of a man who had spent decades handling paper with care. He received them at 8 minutes past 7, and looked at her auction notice for 4 minutes without speaking. Then he said, "The statute revision was published in the County Gazette on the 14th of March. The auction notice was drawn up and filed on the 11th of March. The revision did not apply to notices already in process. This is in the implementation clause of the revision itself, Section 4, subsection C." He said this to Mereth, not to Corvin. She had the impression he was the kind of man who talked to whoever the matter actually concerned. "Can you put that in writing?" she said. "I can do better," he said. "I can tell it to the judge." "I know the judge." The hearing was scheduled for the 2nd Thursday of the following month at 10 in the morning in the county courthouse, a 2-story limestone building on the square that Mereth had passed 6 times on auction day. She went in now. The courtroom was not full, but not empty. Voss had brought 2 colleagues and his own court reporter. Corvin was there, and Osbert Quill and the auction house owner Felderbrandt, a compact, gravel-voiced man of 58 who had run back-tax auctions for 18 years and took procedural challenges to his process as a personal affront. There were also 4 of her Saturday market customers who had apparently discussed the situation among themselves. And in the back row sat her neighbor from across the road, a woman named Hesta Morrow, who grew herbs and had never spoken directly to Mereth, but who had, 3 times in the early weeks, left bundles of dried plants on her tent's guy wire without a note. Pender Voss presented his case with the polished efficiency of a man billing by the hour. He had a timeline, a printed statute, a highlighted section. He spoke about the estate's rights, procedural integrity, the importance of correct notice periods. His volume, as she had observed before, was itself a kind of argument, filling the room with confidence as a substitute for the correctness. He was somewhat short on when it was her turn. She stood. She had not hired an attorney. She had Osbert Quill as a witness, her documents, and the specific truth which she had found most effective when delivered without decoration. She said the auction notice had been filed 3 days before the statute revision was published. She said the implementation clause explicitly excluded notices already in process. She said Osbert Quill, who had drafted 17 county statute revisions in his 22 years as recorder. She said Felder-Brandt had followed every procedure in effect on the day of filing. She said she had paid $940, and she had the receipt, and she had the deed, and she had spent 63 days clearing the land by hand and with her herd, had restored the stone well's cap, had driven her fence posts into the clay on both the eastern and northern lines, had put up a structure on the northwest corner, had filed the milk supply contract with 3 licensed processors, and had been paying her current year property taxes on time. She intended to continue doing all of these things. The judge, whose name was Caro, was a 50-year-old woman, the manner of someone who had heard many versions of many situations and had developed reliable instruments for finding the substance underneath. She asked Osbert Quill 2 questions about the implementation clause. He answered, both, with precision. She asked Felder-Brandt 1 question about the filing date. He confirmed it with evident personal satisfaction. She looked at Pendervoss's highlighted statute for perhaps 30 seconds. Then she said, "The petition is denied. The sale stands. Costs to the petitioner." Pendervoss looked, for just a moment, like a man who has performed a trick that has always worked and found, to his genuine surprise that the audience was watching something else. Then he composed himself, gathered his documents, and left without looking at Meredith, which was the most honest thing he had done in the entire proceeding, because it acknowledged that there was nothing left to say. She sat for a moment after the room began to move and breathe again. Felder-Brandt clapped her shoulder once and said, "Good filing," as though she had done something technical rather than something that had cost her 11 years of savings and 63 days of labor. Osbert Quill shook her hand with both of his and said he had always found the implementation clause perfectly clear and was glad someone had occasion to cite it. One of her market customers said her goat cheese was the best in the county, which seemed to him entirely relevant to the situation. Corvin was waiting outside on the courthouse steps, hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the elm trees just coming into full leaf at the particular quality of a spring morning after something difficult had resolved. She came and stood beside him. "All right," he said. "Yes," she said. They stood in the elm leaf light for a moment. "I have the framing lumber for the porch addition," he said, "if you still want it." She had mentioned the porch addition 6 weeks ago in passing. He had remembered. "I still want it," she said. They walked back to the truck together. Behind them, the courthouse square was doing its ordinary morning business. A woman sweeping a shop step, a cart horse at the water trough, 2 children running the perimeter because space was available and authority was temporarily absent. None of it was extraordinary. All of it was exactly what a county looks like when it continues. The summer that followed was the kind that becomes, in memory, a single long day. Warm and full of work and marked at its edges by light rather than by hours. The porch went up in July. She had helped frame it, and he had helped roof it, and the result faced northeast, which was the direction of her best pasture views and also, though she did not say this, the direction of his fence line. In the evenings when the goats were in and the day's notes were written, She sat in a chair on it and looked at the land she had bought for $940 and tried to account for what it had become. 39 acres cleared and in pasture, 21 in managed browse rotation, which the goats preferred, and which she had found produced better herd health than full clearing. The well producing clean water through the dry weeks of July, when the county road culvert had run to a trickle, the two-room house with its porch, 3 milk contracts and a 4th being negotiated, 11 new goats born in March, all healthy. And one other thing which had grown so gradually, it was difficult to say when it had begun, an understanding between her and Corvin that had passed some time in the spring from neighbor to something with no simple name but that both of them recognized clearly enough by its specific weight. She had told him about the past. Not all at once. Nothing important gets disclosed all at once, but in pieces, over evenings, over fence driving and porch framing, the way you tell things when your hands are busy and the pressure of direct address is distributed across a task. She had come from a situation that had not been safe. For 3 years before she left, she had been the kind of woman who apologized for her own presence in rooms, who had learned to move quietly, not from preference, but from the trained understanding that visibility invited cost. The man who had trained her into that had moved on without apology or acknowledgement. Such men do. But the training remained in her body. She still flinched at sudden voices, still scanned doorways when she entered rooms, still reached instinctively for smaller and quieter when larger and clearer would have served her better. She told Corvin this on an evening in late June, sitting on her new porch with the light going gold across the pasture, plainly, without performing either the injury or the survival of it, because she had found that performance cost more than the telling. He listened, without filling the space, without rushing to conclusions or consolations. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You don't apologize for being here. You built what's here." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "I know you know," he said. "I'm just saying it out loud." It was the most words he had used in a single emotional direction since she had known him, and she understood it for what it was. Not a speech, but a deliberate act of placement, him beside her, on record. He had told her about his wife, in the same distributed way. Her name had been Lena. She had died suddenly at 42, a thing the body does sometimes without consultation or warning. She had been, from what Marath gathered across many small disclosures, a person of extraordinary ordinary warmth, someone who made soup for the whole road, remembered everyone's particular needs, kept the clay pot on the kitchen shelf, filled with whatever was in season. The pot was still there. The lid was still slightly crooked. One morning in July, Marath came to return a wrench and found Corvin in the kitchen with the pot on the table and the lid beside it. She set the wrench down, picked up the lid, and set it back. Straight this time, fully seated, and felt the weight of what that single gesture was trying to carry. He was looking at her. "I didn't mean to presume," she said. "You didn't," he said. They stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then he said carefully, "Lena would have thought you were exactly what this land needed." Then she said, "And you? What do you think you're for?" He almost smiled. And this time the smile arrived. Slow, full, and genuinely his. And she saw in it something that had been in a cold room for 3 years and was now, cautiously, in a warmer one. "Still working that out," he said. "So am I," she said. "That's probably all right." Her brother arrived in August. Theron was 17 and had the look of someone who had been working hard for a long time and was trying not to show how tired it had made him. He came on a bus, and she met him at the county junction with Corvin's truck, borrowed because it could carry more. Theron looked at the truck and looked at her and said nothing about the truck, because he was 17 and operating on incomplete information about several things. She showed him the land, all 60 acres, starting with the cleared pasture and the goats moving through it, ending at the stone well where she drew up a bucket and gave him the first drink. He held the bucket and looked at the well. "You found this," he said. "The goats found it," she said. "Specifically Soot." He looked at Soot, who was nearby and entirely indifferent to her role in history. "What do you need me to do?" he said. "What do you want to do?" she said. He looked at her in the way of someone who has not been asked that recently enough. She said, "I've got 21 acres still in browse. I want to run timber on 10 of it. Selective cut, sustainable rotation. I need someone who can learn the species, the growth rates, the timing. Someone methodical." He was methodical. She knew this from years of his letters. "I can learn that," he said. "I know you can," she said. "That's why I asked." He stayed. He moved into the second room, which she had been using for storage, and she moved the storage to a lean-to she built on the north side, and the house was full in the way. Small houses become full when they are being used for what they were made for. He was good with the goats. He was good with the timber assessment. He was also, she discovered, gifted with numbers in a way she was competent but not. And by September he had built a spreadsheet of projected timber yield and rotation schedules that she found, reading it at the kitchen table with her morning tea, to be the kind of careful thinking that a piece of land rewards when it is offered. She sent a copy to her mother. Her mother wrote back in 4 days, which was fast by their correspondence standards, and said 3 things: that the land sounded like something their family could tend, that Theron needed to remember to eat enough. Meredith wrote back and said the neighbor was a good person. That was all she said. That seemed to be enough. On a Saturday in late September, Corvin came to the porch in the early evening and sat in the second chair, which had appeared in July in the same unannounced way as the kerosene lamp and the fence posts and the casserole dish, talking to the goats in the way you do when you are new to them and still learning their names. Corvin said, "I've been thinking." She waited. "About what this arrangement is," he said. "The fence arrangement." She said no, he said. She waited again. "I'm not going to perform something large," he said. "You know that's not what I do. But I want to be specific about what I'm asking and what I'm not. I'm not asking you to move. I'm not asking you to change what you've built. I'm asking if you want what's on the other side of my fence line to be part of the same thing as what's on this side, without a line between them." She looked at the pasture at Theron, and the goats, and the long gold light across 39 acres she had cleared by hand and watched come back to green. "The clay pot," she said. He understood what she was asking. "It stays," he said. "What's?" "Lena stays. That's not something that ends. But things that have ended can still have something come after them. That's not replacement. That's just how time works, if you let it." She thought about the stone well, how it had been there the whole time, under the brush and the years and the neglect, waiting not because it was patient, but because it was made of something that did not dissolve. how you don't forget a thing to make room for another thing. You discover that you had more room than you thought. "All right," she said. "Yes." Put his hand on the arm of her chair, close and present, asking nothing more yet than acknowledgement. She put her hand on his. Theron did not look up from the pasture. Soot, somewhere in the herd, made the particular sound that goats make. When something has settled, the wedding was small. It was the first weekend of October, the light gone amber, the air carrying the first real cold, the elm leaves beginning to drop in the slow preliminary way that suggests they are thinking about it. Osbert Quill, who was also a county justice of the peace, a detail that delighted her when she learned it, officiated with the precise economy of a man who respects that important words do not need to be many. The 4 market customers came and 2 of the cheesemakers. Hesta Morrow arrived with a bundle of dried, late-summer herbs and presented them without explanation, which was consistent with everything Marath had observed about her. Theron stood beside his sister and put on a jacket he had ironed himself, and looked at Corvin for a long moment when they shook hands. The appraising look of someone taking a measurement that matters, Corvin held it without flinching. After a moment, Theron nodded, once, the way that 17-year-olds nod when they have decided something. After the words were spoken, they ate at long tables on the cleared pasture. Someone had brought a fiddle, someone else a squeeze-box, and the music was neither excellent nor necessary to be excellent. It was warm and present, and moved across the land the way October light moves, without asking permission. Marath stood in the middle of her 60 acres in the late afternoon and sang. It was not a performance. She had not sung in company in a long time. The voice had been one of the things the training had quieted, along with laughing too freely and stating opinions without apology. It came out of her on that particular afternoon, on that particular piece of land, simply because it wanted to and because she was no longer in the habit of refusing it. It was a song her mother had sung while working, something learned in childhood that had never needed a name. Theron recognized it. He looked at her, and something in his face opened like a window. Corvin, who did not know the song, listened, the way he listened to everything, fully, quietly, as though sound were also information about what a person was made of. When she finished, there was a moment of the kind of silence that is not absence but presence. Then the fiddle came back in, and the moment passed into the rest of the evening, which was warm and long and then dark, then full of stars in the way that only clear autumn nights achieve. They sat on the porch afterward, she and Corvin, Theron inside and already asleep, the goats in the pasture making the occasional soft sound of creatures who have nothing to worry about. The frost was back, lightly, just at the edge of the air, and a stone well was visible from the porch, as a darker circle in the dark field. She looked at it. He looked at her. "Whoever dug that, well intended to stay," she said. "So do you," he said. "So do we," she said. He put his arm around her, and she leaned, and the land was quiet, and on the kitchen shelf behind them, the clay pot held a spray of Hesta Morrow's dried herbs, where once it had held only absence. Some griefs you carry forward, some silences you learn to sing through. What makes a life is not the forgetting of what was lost, but the discovery, slow, practical, tested against frost and briar and the particular stubbornness of bad land, that the heart does not have a fixed capacity. It has, instead, whatever room you are willing to dig for, down into the dark, into the stone, where the water has been waiting all along.